Welcome to Flâneurs. Today we've got John Cutler. So a few weeks ago on LinkedIn, he posted this post that caught my eye. I've followed John for a long time on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter and then LinkedIn, and really respect a lot of what John has to say and the nuance that he approaches things with. And so there was this post that caught my eye about in 2016, John had written an article about feature factories that went viral, and he said that he somewhat regretted it. And I read through that post, and I'll put it up here on the screen, or at least parts of it in post so people can see it. And I really enjoyed that. So I reached out to John and said, hey, let's chat about that, because I'd like to hear, I guess John's got a backstory on it, but I also want to hear just about that topic, about that regret of having done it and sort of what that feels like, and go through and talk about I really appreciate the genuine humility that comes through there, and just talk about that generally. And I don't know, that's sort of the topic today. So I'm gonna stop talking and kick to John and just talk about that. And actually, I didn't introduce John, but I assume everybody knows John. At least anybody that watches the show. We talk about John enough that I assume you know John. So John, I'll kick to you, and if you want to do an intro or whatever, feel free. And then
just for those,
yeah, John, I live in Santa Barbara, which is north of Los Angeles. Yeah, background in product management and UX, and I do write a fair amount about product and organizations and I guess teams. The funny story behind that was I was at my partner's in-laws' house, bored, stiff, being there. It was in sort of upstate New York. I'm in this house. Not a lot's happening or going on. And I had signed up for a Medium UX research study, a diary study. And in a diary study, you take out a phone and you record videos of yourself, talking about every day you check in. And they were interested in what it was like to be a writer on Medium. And so the thing that was angering me at the time, I kept saying to them, I was like, you know what? Anytime I try to give any of my posts a fun title, no one reads it. And anytime I give it a catchy title, someone reads it. And I don't have the recording. I have to look back on my phone. But at one point I said, I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to post something tonight, and then we'll see what happens. You'll see what it means. So I get off that thing and I was like, well, wow, I don't know. What's that kind of title? 12 signs you're working in a feature factory. I couldn't do 8, of course I had to do 12, like more than the right number that you could do. But I was like, and I wrote it in like 6 minutes. I mean, it's really fast to write. You're like, well, it's a list. How do you know you're working in a feature factory? You just list these things and it does that. And I remember the next day, because it was, I don't think I processed what was happening, because someone posted it to Hacker Noon really, really quickly. So it started getting in the tens of thousands of views and then hundreds of thousands of views. And I think eventually it topped out over 1 million or 2, like a lot around all the different ways it's been put out there. But it was all to prove a point about sort of vast oversimplifications. And then this idea that like, you're going to know you're working in a feature factory if it meets these signs. And I remember being on the video, like, see, I told you, see that I was right. This is a lot more to do this. So yeah, that's the backstory there. It was written as absolute clickbait by design to prove a point about why clickbait by design shouldn't be as rewarded. And then it was absolutely rewarded.
The self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it was so funny. Yeah, so that's the backstory about that. I don't know if you have any questions about that, but I can jump into some of the most recent posts too, but that was a little bit about, what was on my mind when I got it started.
So what then prompted, I mean, it's been a while. Did you say that was 2016? So what prompted this reflection at this point, or have you reflected for a long time and then?
Oh, I've written about like 20 follow-up posts on that thing, which most people don't read, how to get out of the feature factory with business chops, and scaled feature factories, and why feature factories aren't so bad. And I've written a bunch of these posts, but nowhere near, like they have like 1/100,000th of the traffic, let's say, is the original posted to see those things. In fact, when I was in Amplitude, I worked at a company called Amplitude for a while. I did a multi-year studying why, sort of patterns in teams that, seem to be better at some of these things called product and some that don't. And so I was constantly sort of working against that.
You've even referred to yourself as like, I've been referred to as the feature factory guy. And you've sort of like, because
that was my nightmare. I sort of don't, it's funny because I think that that's the burden that some people have with the success for really good, what I call Trojan horses. Like there's a reason why Jeff Patton is the story mapping guy, because that's a really, really effective Trojan horse. Like lots of people can use it. It's useful. The same thing with opportunity. So I think the opportunity solution tree mapping or whatever it's called, or team topologies is a great example of a perfect Trojan horse. Like you can read it and get it in about 9 minutes, and then it unfolds different layers of value over time. That's probably the quintessential example of a good Trojan horse. Maybe, the Cynefin and complexity stuff can get a little bit like, you do hit a little bit of like a learning curve wall at a certain point, whereas some of those other things have like a nice bend to it. So feature factory would definitely not be the right one to hitch a horse to by any means, because it has all the trappings of a bad Trojan horse in my mind. But ultimately, I wouldn't want that to happen at all. If anything, I became the North Star framework guy, which is this. I ended up writing a book at Amplitude that was not about a new thing that I invented, but just sort of helped people learn something. And I did a bunch of workshops around that. And so if anything, though, that drags me down. People's like, oh, he's a framework guy. I'm like, no, that's one framework of many to do this thing. So
I've got a sort of a confession around the North Star playbook, because you self-published it, didn't you? And then you invited people to like they could pay what you wanted, pay what they thought it was worth. I think was at one point.
Oh, I did my beautiful. Well, no, the North Star playbook was like put out by Amplitude, so it was free to the world. So that's been downloaded by like 200,000 or 300,000 times. Like that's a well-read book at this point. I did a Beautiful Mess podcast, and I did some stuff with my newsletter where I tried to do a book, and then in the middle of the pandemic, I tried writing a book, and literally my head exploded. It was, we had like a 2-year-old in our house, and it was just like, this is not going to work. And I should give people their money back before they get too vested in it. So
I've conflated those two things because I have both of those things. So, and thank you very much for all of those things. But there's a guy that I really love. Is a guy who does a podcast, and he's written books. He's called Blind Boy Boat Club. Brilliant podcast. You should have a look at that, the Blind Boy podcast. But so on
I gotta write this down, Matt.
On Patreon, I think it is. On Patreon, he says, like, this podcast is free to those who can't afford it, and anyone else just buy me a cup of coffee every month. So it was in the midst of that where I'm a patron of that, so I buy him a cup of coffee every month. And then you did that thing, and I just put the amount of like what a cup of coffee was, and then afterwards I was thrown into deep regret about that's probably not enough for that effort.
Oh, that's so funny.
So I apologize, but I hope you enjoy the coffee.
That would be good. Yeah, coffee is a good amount. Coffee is like way more valuable than some books. So fair price, perhaps.
I remember around that time, John, and I don't want to cut it. Sanjay, I'll go right to you because I hear you wanted to come in. I think I had said something to you, John, about you were posting like, oh, there's all these posts, and I think you had suggested a price or something. I'm like, that seems cheap to me because that's only like 10 cents an article. It seems like they should be willing to pay. And you're like, oh, that's a good reframe. Because when the number of articles, you had like 100 articles at that point, because I think it was 2 years of the Beautiful Mess, essentially. And I'm like, man, that's 100 articles. Like $10 is like a dime each.
Yeah, now it's up around, the 800, 900 articles and stuff. And so it's a little bit like, that's a lot. I think though with everyone has a strategy for this type of stuff, and mine has just generally been good things will come. I think that preserving optionality is actually also good. Like if you become the X person, that's great, but then you maybe like lose your options at that point. And so, it's commitment, fear of commitment, apparently, or something like that. on my part.
Mm-hmm. No, I was really, I had actually, I remember I'd fallen, I mean, obviously the sort of viral effect of it, I came upon that post multiple times over the years. And I don't remember if I crossed it the first time around 2016, probably closer to 2017, 2018. But what I enjoyed the most about, that piece you did originally was the sort of critical question, the so what, sort of the nuancing of that. And, and then the peeling that layer back, to sort of incentivize people to, ask that sort of question, which is, obviously it's one of our go-tos in coaching is, and so what, always trying to peel back.
Yeah.
And gain sense. Do you think that was, how do you think that has played out over time? Because I think in our space in general, we tend to want to believe that, there's a learning curve that we're sort of progressing on as a community, right? And as companies, jump into this space. I don't know, how do you feel about that learning curve with respect to, really peeling the layers back and trying to really understand sort of the, some of the really critical value we're after.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes. So specifically in that post Dan saw recently and that I was reflecting on the past was like asking these questions of like, if I had written it all over again, it would be, 12 signs you're working in a company that's building sustainable products that are good for the community and people that you're working with. Like that's a more objective function, that you're trying to talk about. 12 signs you're working in a feature factory might be an objective function, but it's a pretty leading objective function, like the so what, doesn't really fit into those particular things. And so, yeah, that's the specific example, I think, from this recent post. And I think that the timing of it is important, right? Because people are being bombarded by advice about what they should be or what they should do, or that their profession isn't valid anymore, or all these things. And I think now more than ever is a time for people to really get back to their sort of professional philosophy, or just philosophy in general. What do they think about the world? What do they want? What do they think is right for them or right for the people around them? And so we often get caught up in all these sort of methodologies and even, and when I say methodology, people say, yeah, of course, don't get caught up in frameworks, but we've sort of expanded the concept of framework to almost mean sort of like professional ideas or memes, feature factory or product this or blah, 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 blah. And so those aren't like professional philosophies. They're proxies for other things that about meaning and why we're here and why we show up to work and why companies exist and why products exist and do all that kind of stuff. So I think we're in this very sort of mushy world at the moment now regard to professional stuff. And so that's why I think it's more important than ever to talk about these particular things, because otherwise we're just talking about proxies. Here's a really good example I've been thinking about is there is this tension in the world we're in between sort of craft and commerce and sort of humility and community, maybe craft, commerce, and community, the people you're around and why, the business implications about what you're doing, and maybe customer, maybe there's 4 C's or 5 C's or whatever. And it's very easy to have proxies for those things, like working in a certain way. Yes, of course, that's going to be good for customers, but is it? Because I can find plenty of examples of people who work in that way that are not doing things that are good for customers. Another example is I can find plenty of people who care very deeply about their customers, but who are just a little further behind on the curve of a couple skills. Well, we should celebrate that, right? Or not? Like, should we really be celebrating everything Amazon does or everything whatever says? That's the environment we're in at the moment. And I think it's very important to kind of get back in touch with our professional philosophies and our professional identities and our personal identities more than ever now is important.
And those
we don't even.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
We don't even celebrate everything that Amazon does. Cause I've had friends who've worked at Amazon that tell me about these giant books of functional requirements documents they write. And I'm like, so Like we're celebrating the idea of what we think they do or what we've heard certain parts do. So it isn't even a full picture, which kind of gets me to what I wanted to ask you about, John. So what I really love about you and the way that you write is that you come in with a lot of nuance, and it's like you've carved out this position for yourself where you're able to do that and you get traction. But when you first wrote this, right, I mean, kind of like you said, you wrote this as a clickbaity type title and it went viral, and that's in part why it went viral. But now you've got that, like, so I'm actually kind of wondering, do you have advice for if someone wanted to talk in that way? Like, you have this audience that you can speak in this nuanced way and you can care, and Marty Kagan can go out there and say whatever it is he said on Lenny's podcast, and, you know, somewhat, I'm going to give him credit and say that I think it was unintentionally, you know, kind of demean people in their roles. And you come on the back end of it with a response and like, hey, let's not demean, like, there's actually good people here and you care. Like, you've built that ability to do that, but it seems like that isn't what gets love on social media or LinkedIn. They want the clickbaity thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's just sort of the unfortunate nature of the times. I mean, I think that's why community and fostering communities of practice and the people around you is more important than ever, because these aren't communities. There's like the social media platforms don't love you back.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And this is why it's probably good you're running this podcast, or other people doing it, where this is, and this to me is the sort of tragedy in some sense. Like, I'm thinking about the Agile community in some sense. Let's just take a historical view. In the 1990s, I guarantee you 99.99999% of anyone building software, the idea of it selling it like we think about as products was so far away from what was going on that it was just whatever. It was, you know, there's like Yahoo and Mosaic, and like there were some companies, but like most people who were trying to build something, the idea that you could respond to change, mind blowing. Like, let's just give credit where it's due. All these people trying to make life better for people, doing the work in these particular environments and doing it. And you saw such a strong community build from that. And, you know, communities do what communities do. They've got their grand wizards or whatever, and they've got their, you know, empathetic, like, community builders. They've got their figureheads. They've got their crotchety whatevers, you know, they've got their people. And it built this like very robust community over time. That community is probably 30x as robust and resilient as, let's say, the product community, which is a very diffuse, sort of weird professional community.
Yeah.
And some of the big product conferences have actually seen fewer people coming to them and doing these things. And so this to me, but it's when I say the tragedy of it, though, is like, it shows even something as resilient and robust as that still needs to keep working on reinventing itself and challenging itself. This is not just about Agile either. There's a huge thing now in the design community about how there's sort of like a lack of a true north within that design community. And a lot of the figurehead organizations have sort of lost touch, and people are wondering what's next. Like, this is the sign of the times that we're in, about communities being challenged and things like that. And so this is like the real crux of our time, is how to think about professional communities and keep those strong and resilient, and not let them become sort of, maybe the answer is to fracture them. I don't know what the answer is. But this is, that's what comes to mind with what you said. I don't know, it's a tangent, but I think this means that community is much more important than ever.
That resonates. Go ahead, Matt. You actually
keep trying to jump in, but I think that's one of the very attractive things about what you put out in the world. And Dan was saying, like, you know, you got a lot of attention through an experiment you ran in clickbaity grabbing attention. But that, I mean, that's been used really, really wisely. I mean, and I love the fact that, like you're saying there about communities and things like that, like you're saying about well, like Dan said about how that successive clickbait can be misconstrued as this is how to get people's attention. But actually, what you've done with that platform is you've been very diverse. You talk about philosophy, you talk about the arts, you talk about the beautiful mess, which in itself is a beautiful thing. Like, you know, part of our anxieties that we have is because in our workplace political sphere, people are trying to put order where there isn't any, and it causes anxiety. And I think a lot of your output is about sort of helping people come to terms with the fact that, no, you're okay. Life isn't like that. It is a mess, and you can live amongst it, and you can enjoy it, and it's okay to be. And I think that's a really good thing to role model, because, like you say, and you've written some things just lately about, you know, people feeling a bit lost in their profession. Not only that, there was one the other week. It's about people are feeling lost within the profession or the identity they currently have. And they're also feeling it's even more diluted by people are rushing to join that as they think that's the next leap. And that might be diluting the whole thing and tempering it or whatever. But we're sort of like, we're trying to keep those others, and we're trying to keep those out of this sphere because it's competition.
It's becoming very insular. Yeah, people are, I mean, I think this is where the pendulum swing happens. I think that for a lot of people, what the challenge is during the pandemic, it was also, I remember to the day, I was in Manchester and I did an event, like a Mind the Product event or something like that. And then somehow everyone was getting sick from that conference. That was the joke afterwards, like, oh, everyone's feeling really under the weather here. And I think there was a person there from the person who runs Turing Fest, Brian. I'm like a big, I don't know. I was telling beforehand, I'm like, Brian, it's going to be a global thing. There's no way you're going to run your conference. Like, I'm looking at the news. I mean, this is just, the math is there. There's no way you're going to be able to get, like, I've done the modeling in my head. Like, there's no way you're going to run your conference. I'll see you in a couple of years. And he was like, you're crazy, to do these things. But it's funny. So then that shutdown happened. I remember, and probably Dan showed up or other people I showed up knew. I started running these virtual events for Europe where I was just like, we're going to do stuff. We're going to get people together. And there was a massive influx because there was a craving of a certain type of community, like online community shot up. People had a joint experience that brought them together. And they were trying to grapple with things as they were. Now, so when the economy has done what it's done, the reality is that people's experiences are vastly different. People are experiencing the current situation in vastly different ways. Some people are facing the last job of their life. They're not going to ever get a full-time job again, not because of AI, but because there's just ageism and there's a dramatic shift in maybe hiring or whatever. On the other hand, people are like in the prime of their life. This is it. They're on the wave that they thought they would be on. They eat ramen every night anyway. And so they don't have a kid. And so this is going to be great. 2001 and 2008 or whatever, those were fine years because I was flat out freaking broke. You know what I mean? It's like, didn't matter that there was some like global recession. It was like, this is fine. I'm going to roll this one out. Then I'm going to start some companies. It's going to be great. So people are like experiencing the reality in very, very, very different ways. And I think that's what's leading to the sort of tension that we're feeling. It's not a global feeling. It's like vastly different feelings and experiences people are having. And there's competition between people that's either said or unsaid. Anytime someone posts that freaking thing about AI is not going to choose your job, my buddy Joe with his startup is going to get your job, is like, I cringe but it's real. Like, they're just saying, hey, this is competition. This is not like good times here. So it's a crazy time. It's a very divisive time. And so people need to keep that in mind. I
mean, I couldn't agree more. That resonates so much for me because oftentimes, I mean, my background has afforded me the ability to and forced me to have a really multicultural perspective. I was just in Dakar 2 weeks ago.
Wow,
and so,
amazing.
And so, grew up in the States, now in Paris. And so I've always kind of looked at things with a cultural epithet, especially when it comes to, all things agile, the product community. And if you look at the space, if you look at just maybe the African continent, somewhere even in Asia, they're still on this curve of excitement. We're discovering this thing. This thing is awesome. Whereas now, in the States and a little bit slower, but in right behind in Europe, we're right on that almost kind of like spoiled brats kind of mode, right? Where we're making the thing, which is a how, a means to an end, bigger than the actual, so what, right? And so that's what's creating this whole tension, as you're saying, and which is weird because if I go back to, I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who was, getting his chops up, getting his certification. I was like, yo, enjoy this time, experiment as much as you can, don't get too caught up in the next clickbaity thing that you see someone share. Just, take in the perspective, right? And do with it what you may in your context, right? Because the context that's in Santa Barbara or in Paris is different from yours, right? And you're going to have a different sort of tension and feeling and of what it is that you put out and how you interact and weave it into your daily work. So
yeah, that's
one quick
great
pause.
advice for people.
Sanjuri, will you just quickly, will you share with John and the audience? I don't think they know why you were in Dakar, and I think I think that makes it even cooler.
Oh, wow. All right. Put me on a spot there. Well, I went to Dakar because I went to just basically help my mom out, SWAT style, because she was just named. So I just came to just lend her a helping hand. I hope this doesn't go anywhere beyond. I hope this isn't the episode that goes viral. I tend to like to live in the background, so very comfortable in that space. But yeah, so I just went in just to kind of help her, set some basic things in motion, and that was it. So
amazing.
Jeez. I was going to say, from what you just said there, Sanjay, do we think like that's quite a nice, lovely little story that you've got friends who are getting into this world and are getting into the training, because this is something that, John, you've spoken about lately about people sort of we're at each other's throats a little bit, saying, well, people taking the training don't just go for certification, but what the wisdom you've imparted on your friend there, Sanjay, is, well, just enjoy doing the training. I mean, that's okay. And do you think we have a guilt about learning that how, instead of falling in love with the what's going to happen thing? We feel guilty about it, I think, seems. Like wanting to
comes to mind with the skills and stuff is that you do need to adopt a bit of a strategy product mindset to your career. And I think that the hard thing with this is thinking about macro trends, thinking about competencies and experiences and situations where you need to shake up what you're doing. There's a reason why Kent Beck throws himself into a different environment occasionally to challenge himself with thinking about that. And so there was a great quote. I forget who said it. She was listing all of her, like all the stuff she had done over the years, like PMBOK and like Prince and this, and then she got her Six Sigma thing, and then she did this over the years. And she's like, I wouldn't be able to criticize those things now if I hadn't done those things, right? Like I'm the consummate learner to do that. I think the environment we're in, though, is, the idea of expecting more out of a certification. The analogy I use is, right now, let's just say someone prides himself on being a accredited Salesforce developer. Salesforce been around for a certain amount of time. That's great. They understand how Salesforce works. Maybe there's force.com. I don't know, whatever it's called. It's called like they have like this development environment. You can write all sorts of apps and stuff for Salesforce. And if someone was going to pin their hat on Salesforce and let that become part of their identity, you have to ask yourself how long that will last and what your skills are related to that particular thing. Is this a couple decades thing? What are the skills? Because many of those people could just be a developer. That's what they're doing. But if you pin too much of your hat on a movement or on any type of cycle, you'll probably be sorely disappointed at some point later in the future. So that's to try to think about disrupting yourself and disrupting what you're doing. And I think that that's something anyone can take into consideration. However, what I would say is that clashes a lot with how people think about professional certifications in other countries and the tapestry around certifications and craft certifications that exist in around other countries. I was talking with my friend from Nigeria, and he had this just amazing thing where his resume, and this is mildly related, but it makes the point. He was asking me to review his resume. And I look at it and it's like 1 year, 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 1 year at all these different places in Nigeria. And I was like, hey, I got to tell you what that looks like in the United States. It looks like you can't keep a job, my friend. Like, and he's like, no. I was part of one consulting firm and I worked at each place for 1 year and I've done all this. And he literally had product management experience, and scrum mastering experience, project management experience, and everything. And I said, in the US, that's going to look overly diffuse. That's going to not look very focused. He's like, yeah, but in Nigeria, this is what you have to do. Like, I'm building all the skills. I legitimately am good at all these things. And I was like, yeah, damn, you are legitimately good about all these particular things. He's like, and I've got these certifications because I needed to get these certifications to get the consulting gigs that I did at each of these companies. Holy shit. You've been working your ass off. Yeah, for the swear thing. Yeah, you've been working your ass off for the last 15 years, and you're one of the most qualified people I know. But on paper, this looks like a very diffuse career. He's having a lot of hard time finding a job. He recently immigrated to Canada and can't find a job. And people literally just laugh at him almost. And just the level of how he's describing, how he's been treating just makes my heart sick about someone this experienced in this environment. But I did look at his resume and I was like, oh, wow, this is like a huge cultural divide about how expertise is communicated. So just as like a caveat to people, it's easy for me to say, don't ride any certification train or don't pin your hats on one thing. But if you look at how other people approach their technical career in other countries, that often clashes with how they're taught to do it. So I don't know. Hopefully that example is interesting to people.
Definitely.
I'm going to throw a tie back to, because you mentioned Kent Beck, and I've talked about it before on this show. I love Kent Beck's analogy of paint drip people, which kind of talks about, you draw a brush across a canvas and there's drips, and some go deep and some are shallow. And so as you go through time, you pick up more stuff. So that's how I like to, as opposed to T-shaped people where you're deep in one thing. Paint drip just says, you go through time and you acquire different skills. And I like that analogy, and it kind of speaks to even this person you just talked about who has all these different experiences. I think that makes you a more well-rounded person with better skills to. So anyway, it's strange to me that people view that as a drawback. That you've bounced around, because that also ties into one of your posts recently about that I chimed in with my story about the kitchen, about like failing. A person can be successful in one environment, not in another.
Yeah, I love
contextual,
that.
Right?
Yeah.
And just because you failed, so even if let's say someone does have a past of a year for 10 years, it doesn't mean that the 11th one isn't going to be the company that they stick around at for 20 years, right? I mean, anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I think like you said there about having a sort of a product strategy for your career, I think also then is like, we all have to, we're salespeople, everyone's a salesperson, aren't they? So you have a marketing strategy, like a communication strategy, like that same person. Really, what you might have been saying is, well, all of that experience and the certification. I mean, I think that's brilliant. This person got certification because they were going into a job. So they did the perfect thing. I went and did a course and I passed an exam, and then I spent a year doing that actual thing. Like there's nothing that grounds that knowledge in and makes it woven in more than that. But the marketing of what his experience might not hit in all cultures. So talk about it differently. I mean, and experiment with, I mean, I love the fact that we talk about experimentation in delivering in product development and so on like that, and putting it in front of people and all that sort of stuff. But communication's experimentation as well, isn't it? And it's like, you're just learning about, well, what does my audience react positively to? And I think like your advice it was good for him that like, well, in this culture that might not be taken well, so maybe write it differently or describe different.
Yeah, I said, look, you just worked for one consulting company for like 12 years. That's amazing, and you did all this diverse stuff. And people, and it is kind of funny that in the US, we're highly, highly meritocratic, but ironically, we have a hard time believing someone can be good at lots of things. Like, how funny is that?
Unless
right?
you're
like,
Elon Musk and you can be the CEO of 3 companies.
Yeah, like magically, right? Yeah, like if you right, you can be. Yeah, it's funny. Like, we believe in geniuses, but we can't just believe, for all our belief around hard work and stuff, we can't believe that someone can be good or that they can do it. That's the post for the day. That's going to blow up. That's as memey as it gets. That's good. That's the Trojan horse post for LinkedIn.
I mean, there's an economic aspect to keep in mind with some of these other countries where, you know, these certifications have X times amount of value than they would, you know, typically in sort of, you know, in the States or in France and the UK, even though they do have still resident value. As I always tell about people, I tell people, don't just look at the US as just the same way you wouldn't look at the African continent as just like this one big island, right? The US, if you look at your experience dealing with Agile in Illinois or North Vernon, Indiana, is going to be completely different than, you know, in Silicon Valley or, you know, on the East Coast. So I always tell people to keep that in perspective. But also there's an economic aspect to this. You know, if you go to Brazil or Nigeria, all these, you know, different certifications you're going to rack up, it tends to give you more credence. It gives you that.
100%. Yeah. It's like professional. Yeah. That's what,
exactly.
And I think it's so, I don't know. I just wish people could be more open-minded. Or it's funny for people who apparently travel the world and talk to everyone. It sounds like they're talking at people more than they are listening to people from around the world.
Totally agree.
It's more evangelist and colonist versus like listener, you know, for people going around, because it really, really is different. And I think that one thing is interesting as well is that, like, we just have a very hard time talking about skills in general in this particular environment. I mean, I was thinking about it the other day. You know, there's a graduate from a Northern European design academy or school and college environment, just like super, super gifted designer. And they were, I find this kind of interesting, actually. And basically, they were having a very hard time getting a job at a startup, you know, that wanted that thing. And it turned out that a startup really didn't need good design in that level. It didn't need that level of craft. The skill that they were looking for was a skill moving relatively quickly with with a group of people who also were relatively new in their career in a rather somewhat chaotic environment. That was the skill. That's the skill. The skill is not, you know, in, like, for example, in an agency setting, there's people who are incredibly good at agency-oriented design that could deliver an app. You know, you're a bank, you want an app, you can go to an agency, you can get that agency to probably deliver you, after doing a fair amount of UX research and prototyping and stuff, an amazing app. That's a very different skill than the team who's going to sort of organically adapt that and deal with the fuck-upness of the organization and all the like very other things related to it. And so from that perspective, it's also important for people to step back and think very carefully. I mean, social practice theory is a good thing to look into, understanding various elements of just what does competence mean and skills mean. You know, I found one, actually, the most interesting things of something like Wardley Mapping is just, it gets you thinking about how to break things up into their requisite parts. You know, the skill of designing an app is actually sort of a product. You can go to a company and pay that company to design you a good app. The skill of doing that in some weird environment is very emergent. And so breaking up the skill with the experience of having done it is just a very good exercise. And I would actually suggest people sort of Wardley map their career to break up what they think in their experience, to really think about where they are going to position themselves and then think about how to position themselves, like my friend doing a completely alternate resume with only 3 things on it in 1 page. That sort of purposely kind of dumbed down what he did, which is an insane thing to say, but that's what we had to do to make it more accessible, to be honest.
Love that bit about Wardley mapping your career, because I'm not sure, Dan, if you remember in our cohort, I tried to, because we all at some point we're brainstorming on things that we wanted to bring in to offer as a gift to share or to explore and experiment with the others in the cohort. And I had brought up Wordly mapping, and it's such a powerful tool, but it's one of the it's kind of not easy and sort of to sort of break down and get people getting their heads wrapped around.
It's not a good Trojan horse. It's a freight train that you're going to drive through the front door. It's something. Yeah, it's like a soul, like it's like a 1-person D&D game.
Yeah.
That you have to play with you don't just like drop in with your friends when they're playing gin rummy and be like, D&D, everyone. It's like totally accessible. You're going to be more like, you have to like figure out your delivery.
Sid Meier's
like
Civilization.
Start out with like Settlers of Catan or something like that.
Exactly.
Now, interestingly, John, I did pull that trick of trying to get people to do D&D right off the bat, and there was this executive who said, I have no problem reading a book, and so I sent him the PDF of Wordly Mapping, and he texted me he was on a plane. He's like, this book is borderline terrible. I'm like, well, whoops. That was not the right opening foray into
they should love D&D because it's all very prescriptive maturity models. It's all easy. You get the skills, you do the things, you play. It's like the perfect employee. We just need to get this and then cast some spells and shit, and then you're done. That's all.
But these dice are too big. There's too many sides on these dice.
The dice you can, well, it's kind of funny because it needs to be the 3-sided, right? Because they can only think in 3s. But ultimately, if you had a 9-sided die, you could effectively do that because that's 3 by 3. But if you do a 9 box, they like 9 boxes. But you can't do anything more than 3 because that sort of apparently makes people's brain explode to do it.
Well, it's already got a 9 box: chaotic good, lawful good, chaotic evil. That's a 9 box. There's a 9 box in the game, for goodness sakes.
Oh, boy.
So
hey, I think
even that. I've got another one.
Yeah, go.
So what? Some of the stuff that you've brought in there, we've talked about here, and a lot like the breadth of the things that you cover now, probably from the springboard of that clickbait blog a while ago. A lot of the because this is the thing, like I find a lot of your stuff very attractive, very easy to consume, very resonant, and very affirming, and it helps me calm down and things like that. And I can see you helping other people calm down. Is that there's a chap I know, Bob Marshall, that has framed himself for quite a while about sort of being like an organizational psychotherapist.
And he drives people crazy. Sometimes he makes them nervous.
Yes.
We need those people too. We need the Bob Marshalls of the world to do it.
Well, exactly. And also like we were saying before about, was that original, not original because you've done others before, but that sort of, that blog, the Feature Factory, the original Feature Factory sort of article, it was because of the gaps it left, it was fairly provocative. So you rattled some cages and you got some responses, and you got some attention. And then the other stuff that you've woven in, I mean, you're known as a product person, you've talked about being a product person, and a lot of your stuff is about through that product lens. But actually, I do organizational psychotherapist. I sort of view you as I mentioned this chap on our last podcast, which is yet to go out at some point. Some people will start to recognize me, probably rattling on about this guy. But have you heard of Gabor Mate?
No. Oh, Gabor, Gabor. 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 That's so funny. It's funny how our brain works when we're smelling someone's name.
And he talks about trauma and stuff. And I think a lot of the stuff that, well, like the Feature Factory thing, is like a lot of the stuff that you speak about, like you might frame it in terms of like some. So Gabor Mate talks a lot about childhood trauma and then how people probably try and self-medicate through, through drugs and things like that, and how you get over those traumas and stuff. And I just sort of feel like, organizations do a lot of that with self-medicate with deterministic frameworks, and they think, this is gonna sort me out. And I think a lot of your writing sort of like draws that out in people and helps them understand. And with the beautiful message, like, the answers don't lie in there. That you can use them to anchor to, but actually the answers lie in between them, and they lie like the universe doesn't care. Don't use one answer. Play. See the mess is beautiful. And I don't know whether there's a question in there somewhere, but do you feel like there's as your audience has grown, do you yourself feel like how I've just positioned you, like there's you've got a different responsibility in your...
Hopefully. I mean, the thing that I've realized, it is a bit of, I keep bringing up this idea of Trojan horses. So to me, that like a Trojan horse it's probably not a good thing, because, you're not going in there to kill people. So that's not really what you're doing. But, the idea of maybe a wedge is a good idea or something, which is, you can be very arcane and very specialized and appeal to a certain group of people, but usually those are already people who believe in what you're talking about anyway. Yeah. And, and then there's the sort of masses of people to do it. I do think a lot about these wedges or these Trojan horses as a way. Like, I do think that there's a lot of people out there processing stuff. One thing is they come from very different communities, right? They come from very different, it's sort of like what brings people together is really the question. And so, a really interesting example of that, something like product strategy. There's so many different types of people interested in product strategy and so many different unifying things. But, someone like, Ben Thompson, or someone who writes about strategy, is able to pull together the people who care about strategy and keep it fairly, on point or fairly interesting to those particular people. So I do think about what are those things? And maybe this is an analogy people could think about in their companies. Like, what are your wedges? What are your Trojan horses? Like, if all you do is you sort of kvetch in the corner with the three other people talking about, Dave Snowden and Wardley Mapping and sociotechnical systems and cybernetics and, transition design and complex adaptive systems, and, you're up there drawing the wall, that's good. Like, that's good to find that community. The question is there a Trojan horse of commonality? Not that you're playing a trick on people, but is there a way to expand your horizons and draw people in with some common interest into something that will apparently expand your knowledge, and then also maybe expand the knowledge of those folks around you? And to do that, a great example of this is kind of funny. There is a guy named Tom Kerwin. I like Tom's work a lot. He talks about design. He's written this pip deck, which I really like. And him and I will nerd out for hours. And at one point, I'm like, Tom, we need a Trojan horse. This is like insanity. And I said, we're going to write a blog post that lists like 10 skills that leaders need to deal with complexity. And I'm going to write an interview question for each one. And both immediately we cringed, like, oh, that's, ooh, how disgusting is that? You're going to give an interview question, like an interviewer is going to judge someone's ability to be able to handle complexity. Like, how antithetic, how ironic is that? Whatever. And I'm like, no, we got to do it because it scares us. Like, we have to do it because we both hate the idea. And that's been a really, really popular post. People write and they're like, I love it. I love that you wrote the interview questions. I've asked the interview questions to the people on my team. This is really good. And so I had to kind of we had to suck up our pride a little bit. And we were worried about the idea. But then you have to trust that you're going to, if I was to have a Cutler way or a Beautiful Mess way, is like build sense-making capabilities, build the ability to kind of think a couple different angles on things, and then trust yourself, trust your intent, trust your feelings, and then put it out there.
Yeah.
And see what sticks to do this thing. A lot of people don't get to that. Like, example, if you look at LinkedIn, for example, a lot of people are not even aware of any bias in what they're putting. They are not aware that there are people who think it all differently from them in the world. They are not aware that they'll write an example, and Chris would love this if I said it. There's a friend of mine, you know, and he wrote the other day, he said, what was it? Realistic people adapt to the world. Unrealistic people change the world.
Oh God, I love it.
To work for them. And I was like, Chris, we got to talk about this for a second. Like, have you heard of great man theory? Like, that's kind of like great man theory, that it's only great, you know, ambitious men that change the world. Like, I know where you're coming from for that. And like, there's an alternate view of this, that like, think of the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just one person bucking the trend. Like, a lot of discontinuous change happens because of ecosystems and things. But I understand your point too, that, you know, there is this point, you know, here's a dichotomy and pushing it through. He's like, oh, I always love when you challenge me on that particular thing. So I think that the first step is like, we can all build our ability of also like cultural awareness to know where we're coming from, build our sort of trigger detecting mechanisms to know what might rub people the wrong way and how it might work. We can all do a decent job at that. Yeah. And once you've built, but you're never going to be perfect, because you are who you are, and you're not going to be able to be perfect at that. But once you've got to a reasonable level of being able to understand where you yourself fit into the cultural zeitgeist, then you're in a position to think about like how you want to share ideas and learn and explore and doing that. I don't know if that made any sense, but it's like most people could afford like a fair degree of like just cultural awareness and the awareness of different philosophies and ideas and things. And I think that would benefit a lot of people.
Oh my God, that was a that was a brilliant. I hope that's the piece we clip out, because I think if you look at just the tension, the overall tension we're feeling without naming it, that we're going through right now, all the different wars and everything that's going on, it's a complete lack of not only empathy but cultural awareness, right? And so I love the piece about the Trojan horse, because I've often, every time we prepared a proposal, you know, here at my the consulting company I used to work with here in Paris, I talked about cheval de Troie. So that's the Trojan horse, because I always tell people, when we go into this room here, or we have this meeting with this, you know, C-level or this manager, we've really got less than 5 minutes to grab his attention, right?
Yeah.
He has to be confident enough in his ability to replicate, re-articulate whatever it is that grabbed his attention to another audience, and so on and so forth. And so once you have that sort of Trojan horse that galvanizes people around something they couldn't quite articulate, or that's too complex to really break down, or that's maybe, you know, just too complex to break down and take the time and invest to explain to people. But once you have that you have your Trojan horse, everybody can rally around. And what you want is all those perspectives coming together, colliding, and eventually coming to to help solve some semblance of a problem that an organization or group of people have. So,
the analogy I use for the Trojan horse thing, I can use music a little bit too. Like, if you want your friend to get into Brian Eno, don't start with Brian Eno. Like, don't start with the most arcane Brian Eno stuff. You like, maybe start with some David Bowie, you know, like maybe do that. And another example is of a way to think about Trojan horses is like, good 4th of July acts. So like, you know, or let's put the Super Bowl for the side for the second, but like, there's a certain type of band that you can get an incredibly diverse group of people, even music nerds, even people who just want to hear good music, even people who just want to do this. There's probably a great food analogy to this, Dan, too. It's like the Trojan horse restaurant, right? Where it's generally accessible, but it's not because it's shitty. It's not like bad, because that wouldn't make a good Trojan horse. That's not like an entry into good music. That's not an entry into anything. It's just what it is, right? It's just not great music. But there is great music. And some of it just happens to be like more accessible and draw people in. So that's like one of the analogies that I use too. It's like, you're not going to show up at a wedding band and like just jump straight into like a good example, like you're not going to play Bjork's Hyper Ballad at a wedding. It's just not going to work out all that great. It's a really good, it's genius music, but that's not the best Trojan horse into maybe like, I don't know, Icelandic pop or whatever that stuff is.
The comedy version, I think, would be Monty Python. Who's not going to love
Yeah,
Monty?
yeah. The other point too is Trojan Horses change over time. Like I grew up on Benny Hill, basically. Now I was going back and looking at Benny Hill, like it's highly insulting. I remember I brought my partner. I was like, I'm going to give you a slice of my childhood. I used to watch this show called Benny Hill with my dad all the time. It was really a lot of fun. We get through about like 10 seconds of it. She's like, what is this?
Yeah, innocence lost. Brilliant.
Well, I think we're always going to have more to say. We are long. It's great. Right, John. The name comes from something that was taught to me when I go to Paris. I like to just walk around and walk aimlessly and take things in. And someone told me that the word for that is flâner. That's the French word. It's a verb, so I loved it. So it's about meandering through conversations. So we started at a place and then we just meander, which we've done for about an hour at this point, and I love it. I think it's been a great conversation, but we could go on all day long. So I think it's probably time to close out. What do you think, gang?
Yeah, John's got a busy day probably ahead of him. So yeah. I know you will have, Dan, building something.
I mean, I have food poisoning, so my day's going to be very busy. It's going to be good. Yeah.
Our viewers can see it on my hands. I've got remnants from my house projects on my hands, but
oh, nice.
Yeah. I basically re-landscaped my entire house, and now I'm building boxes and I'm doing all sorts of fun stuff. So
yeah, we'll share pictures next time around.
Yeah, one of these days. Maybe I'll give the tour.
Yeah, that was an awesome conversation. I was really happy to be a part of it with you guys, and nice to meet you, John.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks for joining
nice
us,
to meet you too. Yeah, this is great. Cool. Yeah, we'll keep it. There's something here. I like what you all are doing. There's some sort of almost like professional philosophy baked into this.
And cut.